Part 1. The War of Deception. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had broken through the beaches, but victory was far from certain. The Nazis still controlled vast territories, and their armies, though weakened, were disciplined, entrenched, and ruthless. Every move the Allies made was shadowed by the fear of German counterattack, every advance haunted by uncertainty. But in the midst of tanks, artillery, and blood-soaked battlefields, the United States Army quietly assembled a unit unlike any before it. A unit that would not fight with guns or bombs, but with paint, sound, and illusion. Their mission was simple, yet insane. To deceive the enemy, to create ghosts where there were none, and to make the Germans believe entire divisions of men and armor were moving, when in fact, only a handful of artists stood there. This was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known later by a name that sounds almost mythic, the Ghost Army. Composed of just over 1,100 men, their goal was not destruction, but confusion. They would pretend to be tens of thousands, staging elaborate ruses across the Western Front, conjuring fake armies from canvas and rubber. They were the most unlikely of soldiers, artists from Yale and Cooper Union, ad men from Madison Avenue, Hollywood set designers, sound engineers, and radio operators. Men who had once painted murals, designed posters, and crafted illusions for theaters now trained to craft illusions for war. To the Army's higher command, they were a secret experiment in psychological warfare. To the men themselves, it was a bizarre blend of art school and espionage. They were told almost nothing about their mission at first. One veteran, Arthur Shilstone, later said, "We didn't carry rifles. We carried paintbrushes, loudspeakers, and a sense of humor." Behind enemy lines, this humor would be tested in the most dangerous ways imaginable. Because if the Ghost Army ever failed, if the Germans ever discovered the truth, they would be slaughtered in minutes. Part 2. The Artists Go to War. It began in the secrecy of a small camp in Maryland. The men of the Ghost Army were trained not to kill, but to deceive, to understand how an enemy thinks, how they react to sound, light, and motion. Every detail mattered. Every shadow could mean life or death. They learned to move like soldiers of other divisions, to mimic radio chatter perfectly, and to paint unit insignias by hand to match the regiments they were pretending to be. They learned the art of camouflage in the theater of war. But the heart of their arsenal was something utterly unique: inflatable tanks. Built from rubberized canvas, these life-sized Sherman tanks could be inflated in 20 minutes and weighed almost nothing. From a distance, or through binoculars, they looked completely real. When arranged in rows across fields, with the sound of engines booming through speakers, they could convince even the most seasoned German reconnaissance pilot that an armored division was preparing for battle. Alongside the tanks came inflatable jeeps, artillery guns, and aircraft, all lightweight, easy to move, and designed for one purpose: to be seen, but never touched. Then came the sound trucks. Each one was equipped with massive loudspeakers, capable of projecting recorded battlefield sounds for miles. The team recorded real tank convoys, artillery fire, and troop movements, sometimes layering them with fabricated noise to exaggerate their numbers. When the Ghost Army rolled into position, it wasn't just visual, it was auditory. The Germans didn't just see the fake divisions, they heard them. And finally, there was radio deception, the invisible thread that tied the illusion together. Specially trained operators imitated the signal patterns and jargon of real divisions, maintaining fake communication traffic between units that didn't exist. Every element had to sync: sound, sight, signal. If even one faltered, the illusion would break. Their first mission in France tested this coordination to the limit. Outside the town of Normandy's Saint-Lô, they deployed 20 inflatable tanks and dozens of sound trucks to simulate the presence of the 6th Armored Division. The Germans took the bait. They diverted troops to intercept the Phantom Column, while the real division slipped through elsewhere. The deception worked flawlessly. It was the beginning of something extraordinary: art, science, and danger, intertwined in the chaos of war. The Ghost Army became addicted to the thrill of their own performance. As one member recalled later, "We were like magicians, performing for an audience that wanted to kill us." Part 3. Operation Brest and the Great Bluff. By late summer of 1944, the Ghost Army had refined their methods and the stakes had risen. Their next major operation came in support of the siege of Brest, a heavily fortified port city in Brittany. The Germans had dug in, turning every street and bunker into a trap. The Allies needed to divert enemy reinforcements, and the artists of deception were called in. This time, they didn't just create a fake armored division, they created an entire Phantom Corps. Using hundreds of inflatable tanks and trucks, the Ghost Army simulated the arrival of the U.S. 6th Armored Division, on one side of the city. Meanwhile, sound engineers blasted the recorded rumble of convoys, echoing across the countryside. Fake radio operators kept up continuous chatter about fuel shortages, troop movements, and supply drops. At night, they lit fake campfires, erected tents, and even created dummy command posts, complete with fake maps and props in case of enemy reconnaissance. Everything was staged. Everything was an illusion. And it worked. German scouts reported major troop buildups where there were none. Commanders shifted reinforcements to the wrong sector, thinning their defenses where the real attack came. The deception didn't just confuse the enemy, it saved thousands of Allied lives. But with success came peril. The Ghost Army often operated within a few miles of enemy lines, unarmed and exposed. If German patrols stumbled across the inflatables or captured a sound truck, the ruse would collapse and the men would be executed as spies. In one instance, near the town of Metz, German artillery began shelling the area after spotting the fake tanks. The men dove for cover. One of them later joked, "You've never lived until you've been bombed by artillery aimed at rubber." Their courage was quiet, uncelebrated, and deeply human. They weren't fighting for medals, they were fighting to make others believe a lie that would save real soldiers' lives. The Ghost Army began to understand something profound. That art, when wielded with courage and purpose, could be as powerful as any weapon. Part 4. The Masters of Illusion. By the early months of 1945, Europe was a graveyard of cities and dreams. The Nazi Empire was crumbling, but it would not die quietly. The Allies had fought their way through France and Belgium, and now the German army was making its desperate stand on its own soil. To win the war, the Allies would need to cross the Rhine River, a natural fortress running from the Alps to the North Sea. Every bridge was heavily defended, every approach covered by artillery and machine guns. Commanders knew that to force the Rhine would be costly. The Germans expected a massive assault near Dusseldorf, where the river narrowed and bridges still stood intact. If they could be tricked, if the German high command could be made to believe the attack would happen elsewhere, it could save thousands of Allied lives. That deception would fall to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. It was the culmination of everything they had learned: painting, sound, performance, and psychological manipulation. They were not soldiers anymore, they were directors of an invisible theater, staging the most dangerous performance of their lives. The operation was codenamed Viersen, after a small town near the Rhine. In late March 1945, the Ghost Army arrived in darkness. Trucks carrying deflated tanks rolled into muddy fields, while others set up sound trucks and fake command tents. Every movement had to be precise. They worked in near silence, under blackout conditions. Surrounded by real frontline troops, who had no idea these men were illusionists, not infantry. As dawn broke, the stage was ready. Across the field stood dozens of life-sized Sherman tanks entirely made of rubber and canvas, inflated overnight by air compressors. Each one was positioned to cast convincing shadows for German aerial reconnaissance. The men even drove bulldozers to leave tank tread marks in the mud, so that when enemy spotters studied aerial photos, the terrain told the same story as the eye. Behind them, sound engineers from the 3,132nd Sonic Company started the next act. Massive loudspeakers, hidden behind haystacks and camouflage netting, began to emit the deep rumble of engines, metallic clanks, and shouted orders. The recordings were made months earlier, authentic, layered, and perfectly timed to sound like a 30,000-man army moving into position. The sound carried for miles, bouncing across the Rhine Valley. Then came the radio operators. Using carefully scripted communications, they mimicked the chatter of the U.S. 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. They even simulated the frustration of poor weather delaying operations, ensuring the Germans heard exactly what they expected to hear. Within hours, German intelligence had intercepted their signals. Reconnaissance planes flew overhead, photographing the fake positions. When those images reached German headquarters, they confirmed what they already suspected, that the Allies were preparing a major assault at Viersen. And so the Germans concentrated their forces there. Artillery, armor, and infantry rushed to reinforce the area. Meanwhile, the real Allied crossing, the one that would break into Germany's heartland, began 10 miles north, at Wessel. The deception was complete. By the time German commanders realized their mistake, it was too late. The Allies had crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance, paving the way to the fall of the Third Reich. After the operation, even hardened generals were stunned by what the Ghost Army had achieved. No shots fired, no direct combat. Just illusion, 1,000 men convincing the enemy that they were 30,000. One officer wrote later, They fought with imagination instead of bullets, and imagination proved the deadliest weapon of all. But to the Ghost Army themselves, the triumph was bittersweet. They were elated yet haunted by the strange emptiness of their victories. When real soldiers advanced past their fake camps, they found the shredded remains of inflatable tanks and the hollow echoes of recorded gunfire. The artists had vanished, leaving behind only ghosts. One soldier, reflecting years later, said softly, "We painted illusions in a world that had forgotten beauty. Maybe that's what kept us human." Part 5. The Artists Behind the Masks. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Ghost Army's mission came to an end. Their props, the tanks, the speakers, the mock insignias, were dismantled and destroyed. Their records were sealed. Their existence, officially, was erased. Each man signed documents swearing never to reveal what they had done. The penalties for disclosing classified information were severe, and so, for decades, they said nothing. Their parents thought they had served in ordinary engineering units. Their wives and children assumed they had guarded depots or fixed radios. In reality, they had stood face to face with death, unarmed, armed only with the power of deception. The men returned home to an America ready to forget the war and rebuild. Some returned to art schools. Others found work in advertising, design, or architecture. But their experiences had changed them profoundly. Ellsworth Kelly, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated American abstract painters, once said that his sense of form and shadow came from watching light move across the inflated tanks in the fields of France. Bill Blass, who later became one of the world's most influential fashion designers, had spent his wartime years sketching camouflage patterns and insignia for imaginary regiments. They carried fragments of the Ghost Army into their art, their fashion, their architecture, a kind of quiet echo of their secret war. Yet despite the passage of time, the memories remained vivid. Arthur Shilstone recalled, "We weren't fighting to kill. We were fighting to make the other guy think we were going to kill him. There's a strange morality to that." And that morality haunted many of them. They had created illusions that caused chaos and panic, that sent enemy soldiers running or surrendering in fear. They had saved lives, but they had also weaponized art. Late at night, some of them would dream of the sounds they once created, the rumble of fake engines echoing through the dark. It was a memory, equal parts pride and guilt, beauty and horror. Part 6. Secrets Revealed. For nearly 5 decades, the Ghost Army's story was buried in classified archives. Even among military historians, their name was little more than rumor. Then, in the early 1992s, the U.S. government began to declassify long-hidden wartime records. Among them were faded photographs of inflatable tanks, diagrams of sound trucks, and top-secret reports marked 23rd Headquarters, Special Troops. The truth began to emerge slowly at first, then with awe. Historians were stunned by the scale of the deception. Here was a unit that had carried out over 20 major operations, from Normandy to the Rhine, each one a complex act of theatrical warfare. They had operated within a few miles of enemy lines, often completely unarmed, impersonating entire divisions with the precision of professional actors. And their success was measurable. Intelligence analysts later concluded that their operations saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives, men who would otherwise have died in traps, ambushes, or misdirected counterattacks. As veterans spoke publicly for the first time, a wave of astonishment followed. News programs and documentaries rushed to capture their testimonies. Audiences couldn't believe that the U.S. Army had secretly fielded an entire unit of artists and designers whose weapons were creativity and illusion. Yet the veterans spoke humbly. "We weren't heroes," said one man. "We were just trying to do our job and get home." Still, the story resonated. In an age dominated by brute force, these men had won battles with imagination, proving that art could be an instrument of survival. The more the world learned, the more the Ghost Army became a symbol not just of cunning, but of human creativity's power to resist destruction. In 1996, the U.S. Army officially recognized the Ghost Army's contributions, lifting the final veil of secrecy. But for many of the surviving members, the acknowledgement came too late. Dozens had already passed away, their stories untold, their courage unrecognized. It would take nearly another 3 decades before the full measure of their heroism would be honored. Part 7. The Legacy of Imagination. In 2013, surviving members of the Ghost Army, now in their late 80s and 90s, gathered in Washington, D.C. for a reunion. They arrived in wheelchairs, leaning on canes, their once youthful faces now weathered by time. But their eyes still carried that spark, the mischief, the humor, the quiet pride of men who had fooled the mightiest army in the world. As the story spread through museums, documentaries, and books, the Ghost Army captured imaginations once again, not as a secret weapon, but as a testament to human creativity in the face of horror. In 2022, after decades of advocacy, Congress finally awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. The medal was engraved with the image of a soldier standing before an inflatable tank, a symbol of the men who used art not to destroy, but to protect. During the ceremony, one veteran wept quietly. He whispered, "We fooled the enemy back then, and now, after all these years, the world, finally, knows the truth." The Ghost Army's story is not just about deception, it's about the triumph of imagination over violence. It reminds us that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it wears camouflage, paint, and carries a rifle, and sometimes it holds a paintbrush, a radio, or a roll of canvas. When we think of World War II, we often picture tanks, guns, and bombs, but the Ghost Army reminds us that art can be a weapon, too. A weapon that saves, not destroys. A weapon that confuses, but never kills. Their legacy lives on in museums, in art, and in every act of creative defiance that challenges the darkness of war. The Ghost Army was born in secrecy, thrived on illusion, and disappeared into silence. But their story, once invisible, has become one of the most extraordinary tales of the Second World War. A story of painters, sound engineers, and dreamers who turned deception into an art form and art into a weapon of hope. They were not ghosts anymore. They were the artists who fooled the Nazis and changed the very meaning of war.